Thanks.
Thank you, John. I'm happy to be here. I've been at a Facebook board meeting all day, so it's nice to be with somebody over 12 years old. That'll get me in a lot of trouble. I came here literally for one reason. George Shultz is a man I have admired, respected, looked up to, followed, read about, studied, and tried to emulate my whole life. I think he is truly the great man of our generation, and I'm proud to be here for you. He is the best. I got a really tough subject, so I want to lighten it up a little bit if I can. I can't be as good as my partner, Al Simpson. I wish I could. By the way, Al came out here and talked to this group, and, Al said that, was talking about why they call this thing Simpson Bowles rather than Bowles Simpson. And this is one of the few things that, Al and I agreed upon immediately. The reason we like to call it Simpson Bowles is everything in Washington is known by its initials. I really liked John's introduction, but I want to tell you what it reminded me of. I was born and raised in North Carolina, and I remember when my Uncle Sam died, and he lived in Greensboro, and when he died, the obituary editor of the Greensboro Daily News called up my aunt to ask about him. And my aunt kind of went on like John did about me, describing all these things he had done. And after a few minutes, the obituary editor said, "Now, Miss Bowles, you do know that we now charge." Yeah, we charge $5 a word for every word we put in the obituary. She said, "Oh, my goodness, no, I didn't know that." She said, "In that case, just put in there, Sam died." This is a true story. That's not even the funny part. And he said, "Well, Miss Bowles, I'm sorry, we'd really like to do that, but you see, we have this 5-word minimum." She said, "Oh, my goodness." She said, "In that case, put in there, Sam died, Cadillac for sale." I can assure you that's what my wife is. Really, the reason I got to get out of here is I got to get home. I've been gone for 24 straight days. And, now that I'm retired, I'm supposed to live at home. And my wife and I have been married 42 years, but the secret to our success is we've only lived in the same town for 20 of those 42. That's really true. The last thing I would say, I did just finish 6 years as president of the University of North Carolina. And, I'm a business guy. And somebody, when I was walking in today, asked me, they said, "Erskine, tell them what it's like to be president of a university." Well, I can tell you exactly what it's like. Being president of a university for a business guy is exactly like being CEO of a cemetery. It is. You got lots of people underneath you, but ain't nobody listening. The last thing I'll tell you before I have to start, remember this is a really tough subject, is, I love Al Simpson. I know he's a great friend of the secretaries, and he really is an unbelievably great guy to be with. We've had so much fun. So I went out to Cody, Wyoming for his 60th wedding anniversary, and there was this great picture in his living room of Al and his wife Ann, who's beautiful, and Al and Ann's twin sister Marie. And so I said, "Al, I never knew that Ann was an identical twin." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, how'd you tell them apart?" He said, "Erskine, I never thought that was my responsibility." So that's what you're missing today. He's terrific. And now, when President Obama called Al and me and asked us if we would co-chair this National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, we both originally thought we were doing this for our 15 grandkids, my 9 and his 6. But the more we we did our homework, the more we looked at the operating statements of the country, the clearer it became to us we weren't doing this for our grandkids. We weren't even doing it for our kids. We were doing it for us. That's what reality is today. I believe that if we don't get these elected officials in Washington, on the right and the left, in the White House and in the Congress, to put some of this ultra-partisanship aside and to pull together rather than pull apart, that we face the most predictable economic crisis in history. Luckily for all of us and for our kids and our grandkids, it's also the most avoidable economic crisis in history. But there is no question in my mind, and I think I can prove it to you in a minute, that the fiscal path that our nation is on today is simply not sustainable. And these deficits of what have been over $1 trillion will be at least $500 billion a year over the next decade. These deficits are a cancer, and it's a cancer that will truly destroy our country from within. Let me give you just one arithmetic example, and I think it'll put it in perspective. If you look at the operating statement of a country for last year, not 20 years ago, not 20 years from now, but last year, every single dollar of revenue that came into the country was consumed by what's called our mandatory spending and interest on the debt. Mandatory spending is principally what we spend on the entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. So what does that mean to all of us? It means that every single dollar that we spent last year on the war, on national security, homeland security, education, infrastructure, research, every single dollar was borrowed, and half of it was borrowed from foreign countries. That is a formula for failure in anybody's book. And when Al and I go around the country and talk to groups of people, you know, the first thing people ask us is, why? This is crazy. You know, why would we do this? You know, what are we spending this money on? And we always turn it around and we say, well, you tell us what you think the problems are. Where do you think we're spending this money? And we always say the same 4 or 5 things. And Al always says, Erskine, you better say 4 or 5 or you might get one of these Rick Perry deals. So you, but they say first waste, fraud, and abuse. And then somebody say, no, it's foreign aid. And then somebody say, no, it's oil subsidies. And then somebody else say, no, it's Nancy Pelosi's airplane. You know, and I swear you could take all of those things and put them in a thimble, and it wouldn't amount to a hill of beans. That's not the problem. We have 5 big challenges we face in this country today. And if we don't step up to these 5 challenges, we will face this most predictable economic crisis in history. Let me talk about all 5, and I'll go through them quickly. And then any of those you want to discuss, we can do in the question time. First challenge we face, by far the biggest challenge, is health care. You know, you and John have written a great book on it. But, you know, we spend today twice as much as any other developed country in the world on health care. And that's true whether you talk about it on a per capita basis or a percent of GDP. And, you know, I personally would probably be okay with that if our outcomes were twice as good as anybody else's. But they're not. You know, we rank somewhere between 25th and 50th in such important outcome measures as life expectancy or infant mortality or preventable death. And those 40 million people that don't have health care insurance today, you know, they've been getting health care. They just get it at the emergency room. That's, you know, somewhere between 6 and 8 times the cost it'd be in the doctor's office. And that cost doesn't disappear. It gets cost shifted. And it gets cost shifted to you 2 ways, in the form of higher taxes and higher insurance costs. In 1981, we spent just about 10% of the federal budget on health care. This year, we spent about 25% of the federal budget on health care. By the end of this decade, we'll be spending a third of the budget on health care. And it won't be long if we take the ostrich theory and just stick our heads in the ground and try to get away with doing nothing. You know, all we'll be able to afford is to, you know, take care of a couple old coots like Al and me and buy a few tanks, literally. Healthcare is by far our biggest challenge. We can talk about some solutions if you'd like. Number 2 is defense. We spend more today on national defense than the next 17 largest countries combined. And that excludes both Russia and China, and that excludes the cost of a war. That's crazy. I think that America is bearing a disproportionate responsibility for global world peace, and I don't think we can afford to be the world's policeman. And I think Admiral Mullen, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under both President Bush and President Obama, got it right. You know, when he was asked, you know, what's our nation's greatest national security problem? He didn't say these terrorists. He said it was these deficits, because they will consume every dollar of resources that we need for everything else that America needs to do. Let me just give you one example of how crazy it is. Today, America has a treaty. We have a treaty with Taiwan that will protect Taiwan if they're invaded by the Chinese. There's just one problem with that. We'll have to borrow the money from China to do it. It's crazy. Number 3. I think we have the most inefficient, ineffective, globally anti-competitive tax code that man could dream up. I could ask the finance professors at Duke University to design a new one, and they couldn't design a stupider one. I hate the Dukies, I swear I do. I'm with you. But literally, what we proposed is that we ought to broaden the base, we ought to simplify the code, we ought to get rid of all that backdoor spending in the tax code. And we ought to use 97% of the money to reduce income tax rates, and we ought to use about 3% of the money to reduce the deficit. Where Paul Ryan and I differ, is Paul wants to use 100% of the money to reduce income tax rates and none of the money to reduce the deficit. I want to use 3% of the money to reduce the deficit. I think that's a pretty good trade. If we did that, what would happen to your income tax rates? We could take income tax rates to 8% up to $70,000, 14% up to $210,000, and have a maximum marginal income tax rate of 23%. We could take the corporate rate to 25%, and oh, by the way, we could pay for a territorial system so that $1.5 trillion today that's captured overseas could be brought back to this country to create jobs over here. We think that would create dynamic growth in the country. Now, my Democrat pals, and I assume there are 1 or 2 of you out there, my Democrat pals, you know, they go crazy when I say that. You know, they say, Erskine, all these corporations, all they'll do is they'll use that money to pay dividends or to buy back their stock. And I say, great. At least that money will be circulating here, creating jobs over here rather than being stuck overseas. Again, we think that would create dynamic growth in the country. The fourth big issue we face is another one that the Secretary has written a lot about, and that's Social Security. You know, people always say that Al and I made these proposals on Social Security to reduce the cost of Social Security, that we're going to throw Granny over the cliff. Hey, we are Granny, you know. You know, what we want to do is make Social Security sustainably solvent. We want to make the promise of Social Security actually real. You know, this Roosevelt guy was a very smart guy. When he created Social Security, life expectancy was 63. You got Social Security at 65. That is a very smart guy. Today, average life expectancy 79. You get Social Security at 62. We have an arithmetic problem. And believe me, the changes you have to make, and again, John and George have written about it extensively, are really relatively minor to make sure that Social Security is actually there. Let me give you an example of the most controversial recommendation we made. We recommended that we raise the retirement age 1 year, 40 years from now. We wanted to give people a chance to get ready. And 1 more year, 65 years from now, when my grandkids will be eligible. But that really is the kind of, really de minimis change you have to make in order to make the promise of Social Security actually real. So Social Security is number 4. The 5th big challenge we face is an outcome of the other 4, and that is interest on the debt. We spend about $230 billion a year on interest today, and that's at today's artificially low interest rates. I think, Michael, even you'd agree that those are pretty artificially low. To kind of put it in perspective for the rest of you, that $230 billion is more than we spend at the Department of Commerce, Education, Energy, Homeland Security, Interior, Justice, State, and the court system combined. And if interest rates were at their median level they were in the 1990s, or in the first decade of this century, we'd be spending over $600 billion a year on interest. And do nothing, just take the ostrich theory, stick our heads in the sand. By the end of this decade, we'll be spending over $1 trillion a year on interest cost alone. And think about the effect that has in this country. That's $1 trillion that we can't give back to the taxpayers. Or it's $1 trillion we can't spend to educate our kids, or to build our infrastructure, or to do high value added research on campuses like this. And what makes it doubly bad? A large portion of that $1 trillion is going to be spent in the countries that we're borrowing money from, some of which ain't exactly our pals, to educate their kids, to build their infrastructure, to do the high value added research on their campuses. So the next new thing is created over there, not here, and the jobs of the future are there, not here. I think that's nuts. And if any politician on the right or the left comes out here and tells you, don't worry about this, we can grow our way out of this problem. We can't solely grow our way out of this problem. You could have double-digit growth for the rest of this decade, and that won't solve this problem. And if any Democrat comes out here and tells you, don't worry about this, we can tax our way out of this problem, we can't solely tax our way out of this problem. Raising taxes doesn't do a darn thing to change the demographics of a country or to change the fact that health care is growing at a faster rate than GDP. And as much as I'd like to tell you that we can solely cut our way out of this problem, we can't without disrupting what I believe is still a very fragile economic recovery, or without hurting the truly disadvantaged, or without making such severe cuts in things like education and infrastructure and research that America's not going to be able to compete and win in what I believe is today a knowledge-based global economy. So what we tried to do was to come forward with a rational, reasonable, responsible, bipartisan recommendation to the President that would reduce the budget deficit by about $5.2 trillion over a 10-year period. And we didn't make that number up just because the number 52 bus passed us out here on the street. That's not the maximum amount you need to reduce the debt. It's not the ideal amount. That's the minimum amount you need to reduce the deficit in order to stabilize the debt and keep it on a downward path as a percent of the economy. We got a majority of Republicans on our commission to vote yes. We got a majority of Democrats, and we got a supermajority of the commission to vote yes. And I think what made Al and I the happiest, the proudest, was the diversity of viewpoints of people who actually voted yes. We had 6 sitting U.S. senators on our commission. 5 out of the 6 voted yes. And that was everybody from Dick Durbin, who's about as far to the left as you can get, the Democratic senator from Illinois, to Tom Coburn, the Republican senator from Oklahoma, who's probably the most conservative member of the Senate. But these guys voted yes because they thought it was the reasonable, responsible, right thing to do. So what Al and I have been doing over the last couple of years is trying to build up additional support in the House and in the Senate and to push the president out of his comfort zone so that we can make the compromises we have to make in order to put our fiscal house in order. So where does it stand today? What's happened and where are we today? I think if you look at what's happened to date, we've done the easy stuff, we've done the stupid stuff, and now we got to get serious and do the hard stuff. The easy stuff, well, we raised your taxes. You know, politically, that's not such a difficult thing to do. And we cut spending, we cut discretionary spending by about $2 trillion. And, but we did it by capping the spending, so we're not going to tell you what we're going to cut. Again, politically, that's pretty easy to do. We're going to make these cuts, but we're not going to tell you what we're going to cut. And we've done the stupid stuff, the sequester. I was playing with one of my grandkids the other day, and he's so tired of hearing me talk about the sequester, he said, "Pop, let's play Star Wars." I said, "Great, I'll do it." He said, "Yeah, I'll be Darth Vader and you can be sequester." I knew you'd like that, Dick. People have asked me about the sequester. It's a good thing, bad thing. It's $1.2 trillion of across-the-board cuts in the discretionary spending. And I said, look, it's just stupid. As a matter of fact, it's stupid, stupid, stupid. It's 3 times stupid. And it's stupid first because it's across-the-board cuts. There's not a one of you here that's run any business that makes your cuts across the board. You go into a budget if you really want to make some responsible cuts, and you make those cuts in the areas that have the least adverse effect on productivity. So this is not that. This is across the board. The second reason it's stupid is it's in the discretionary budget, which is the part of a budget that you can arguably make the best case that, we really ought to be increasing some areas of that budget. And the third reason it's stupid is none of the cuts are in the entitlement programs, which are growing at a faster rate in the economy, where we must make some cuts, or they literally will consume the entire budget and bankrupt the country. So that's the stupid thing. So now we do have to get serious and do the hard stuff. So what do we need to do in order to put our fiscal house in order? The first thing we have to do is to reform the tax code so we're globally competitive. We do live in a global economy today. The second thing we got to do is we've got to make these cuts in health care that slow the rate of growth of health care on a per capita basis to the rate of growth of the economy. The third thing we have to do is we have to make Social Security sustainably solvent. And the fourth thing we have to do is look at where we're spending the rest of the money. A lot of people in Congress today believe we ought to increase spending in some areas. I'm not for increasing any spending until we start spending the money we're supposed to spend today more wisely. Let me give you 2 examples that are pretty controversial. When I first became the president of UNC, my number one goal was for us at the university to do our part to improve K through 12. The product that's coming out of K through 12 today in the U.S. is nowhere near globally competitive. I could give you a zillion examples of that. I just got back from China and Singapore the other day, last week. And in China, as an example, I went to, in Beijing, to a 6th grade classroom where they were taking algebra in English. Yeah. And I went to Singapore. Today in Singapore, 44% of our 8th graders this year scored at the most advanced level on the international test in math and science. In the U.S., less than 2% of our kids score at the most advanced level. In fact, less than 34% of our kids are even proficient, much less at the most advanced level in reading, math, science, or writing. And what happens to those 8th graders in the U.S.? For every 100 8th graders in the U.S., 58 of them graduate from high school, 38 go to college, 28 come back for the second year of college, and 18 graduate. And we're going to compete in a knowledge-based global economy with that kind of track record? I don't think so. So we made it our number one goal to improve K through 12. I figured out that we were not only part of a solution, but we were darn well part of a problem because we produced most of the teachers. And we not only had to produce more teachers, we had to produce better teachers, and we had to produce more math and science teachers. So I turned to our staff, again, this is my first day, and I said, look, we've got to improve the quality of teacher education. I said, surely there's some programs in Washington that will help us do that. Go check and see what's there. Well, there were. There were 82. Now, do we need 2 or 3 really good programs? You bet. But we don't need 82. I'll give you another example, and I'm sure Stanford is in the same position. At UNC, we do $1.6 billion worth of federal scientific research every year. Is all of that high value-added research? Hell no. It's not even close. Nor is it at the 3,000 other colleges and universities that are doing federal scientific research. We've got to spend the money we're spending more wisely. I believe I was at Columbia the other day doing a talk like this, and the professors there, said, give us an example of what you're talking about that we can relate to. And I said, we're in the same position as the great Nobel Prize-winning scientist Ernst Rutherford was when his Nobel project was running out of money. He turned to his team and said, hey, we're running out of money. Now we got to start thinking. But that's what the U.S. is. We're running out of money. Now we got to start thinking. We got to make wise decisions, tough decisions. We got to make the hard choices, the politically difficult choices. I'm confident that if we do, that the future of this country is very, very bright. And we can compete with the best and brightest wherever they are. But I'm equally confident that if we don't, that our country is well on its way to becoming a second-rate power. And that's what, I'm here to fight over. I'm a partner in a private equity firm with Hank Paulson. Hank and I married girls out of the same class at Wellesley, a zillion years ago. We've been lifelong friends. And Hank wants me to spend more time at the business and less time out here fighting to get support from people like you. So you'll put some pressure on your members of Congress to put the partisanship aside and to pull together rather than pull apart and do something about our long-term fiscal problems. So Hank says, Erskine, you're just wasting your time. He said, nothing in Washington is going to happen without a crisis. And I said, Hank, you're probably right. I said, I bet 90% you're right. But we got to try. Bouncing from crisis to crisis to crisis is crazy. George and I were just talking a minute ago. This is the largest economy in the world. Do we have a long-range plan? No. If Stanford University didn't have a long-range plan, you'd fire the president. Well, for us, it's even worse. Not only do we not have a long-range plan, we don't even have a budget. And we haven't had a budget for 4 full years. As a matter of fact, we are operating the largest economy in the world on a month-to-month basis. That is crazy. So we got 2 choices. We can actually have this crisis, or people like us can encourage our members of Congress to put this partisanship aside and pull together and make the hard decisions. I think it's up to us. I told my kids, I feel responsible. You should feel responsible. We elected these characters. I'm afraid that if we don't get them to wake up and do the tough things, then we're going to be the first generation in history to leave the country worse off than we found it. That's unacceptable. So I came here today, thanks to Secretary Schultz, to ask you to help us. Help us get these members of Congress, help us to get this administration to work together to solve this problem. Thank you very much. If you have any problems with my arithmetic, my old finance professor from Columbia is here, Professor
George Parker.
And Dick Friedrichs, who was in my class, can tell you I went to all the classes, so I did my best to learn what Professor Parker taught.
Erskine, we talked briefly, we had a chance to talk before, and I was asking you, it seems like the moderate Democrats and the moderate Republicans are kind of going extinct in Washington. Is that an illusion, or is that really happening, and why?
Yeah, I'd say it's reality today. And if you look at the way I'll use the House of Representatives as an example. If you look at the way the congressional districts are divided up today, the elections are no longer in the fall, they're in the spring. And most of the congressional districts today are either an all-Democrat district or an all-Republican district. And the problem that somebody like me has, if I go to a Democrat and ask them to support entitlement reform, which we have to do, if we're going to keep the promise we've made to the American people, then for sure, during the primary, the AFL, the AARP will not only get somebody to run against this Democrat, and there'll be somebody that's to the left of this Democrat, and they'll not only get them to run, but they'll finance them, and they'll probably win the primary, and that's tantamount to the election. And the same thing's true with the Republican. If we find a Republican who will support tax reform that's anything other than revenue neutral, then for sure Grover Norquist in his great white robes will flow down, and he, along with somebody like the Club for Growth, will not only get somebody to run to the right of this person, but also fund this person, and this person will win the primary, and that'll be tantamount to the election. So what we have in the Congress today is the extreme lefts and extreme right, and very, very few people left in what I would call the sensible center.
Your turn. Yes, right here in the front.
Tax reform, because it seems like if you have a revenue neutral solution, it should be a slam dunk to get it passed. What else is going on that makes it tough for one side or the other to not get comfortable with a tax reform? Is there stuff that we're just not aware of that prevents politicians from supporting a revenue neutral, revenue positive outcome?
Yeah, last year we had about $1.3 trillion worth of income tax revenue coming to the country, about $1.1 trillion from individuals, about $200 billion from corporations. And people all the time ask me, and I just want to put it in framework, I'll answer it. People all the time ask me, you know, how can we have such nominally high rates and net such relatively small amount of money? And the reason is we have this $1.1 trillion of backdoor spending in the tax code in the form of deductions and credits, many of which, you know, those of us in this room really like. You know, things like the mortgage interest deduction, the charitable deduction, deduction for state and local taxes, you know. So it's not things that, you know, we don't like, but there are about 129 of them, and they're all through the code. And the maximum amount that we need of that money to reduce the deficit, so it's not on a revenue neutral basis, is about 500 to 600 billion over 10 years. And since we have at least 1.2 trillion now of deductions and credits, if you look at it over a 10-year period, that's like $14 trillion. So basically you need about 3% of that money, you know, to go to reduce the deficit, and the rest of the money you could use 97% of it to reduce income tax rates. The reason that Democrats won't support revenue neutral, which is where, you know, people like Paul and Dave Camp are, is that they believe that without having additional revenue, it'll place too much burden, and you'll have to cut things like education, infrastructure, and research, or you'll have to cut some of the income support programs like SSI and food stamps and unemployment compensation, or if you don't want to go there, you'll have to make even deeper cuts in Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. So they would like to see some of the money come from reducing revenue, and some of them increasing revenue, and some of the money come from cutting spending. We took 25% of our money from revenue from reforming the tax code, and 75% of the money from reducing spending. I thought that was the right balance.
Yep.
Thanks for your comments, Erskine. Point 5 was the interest rates on debt. My understanding is the debt structure is less than 4 years for the entire government debt. Why don't we go long at this interest rate level? And I've never found anybody that didn't agree with that, but that we don't do it.
Well, you know, if Professor Parker is still here, he would say, you know, surely we should be financing long-term needs with long-term funds, right? That we ought to have a balance there. You can probably answer the question. If they go long, then they've got to pay higher interest rates, and if they pay higher interest rates, then they look like they're doing a worse job. And so it's all politics. There's no economic reason for it.
Third row, we're going row 1, row 2, row 3, here we go.
So on the revenue side, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the resistance has to do with closing those deductions. So is that part of what do you need to close all of them? Is that part of the problem, is that you really have to go across the board? And the second question was, when you came up with your $5 trillion of reduction, what kind of GDP rate are you assuming?
Sure, both good questions. We assumed that over the 10-year period, we have about, on an average, 2.7% real growth and about 2.2% of inflation. So that's the assumptions we made. So obviously, if we had faster growth, you know, we'd have, you know, less need. If we had, you know, lower deficits, if we had slower growth, we'd have less need. And we used the estimates that came from the Congressional Budget Office, so it would be, you know, so it'd be nonpartisan. The first question was, yeah. What we wanted to do was we wanted to start by wiping out all of them to prove to people how low you could actually take rates to 8% up to 70,000, 14% up to 210,000, maximum rate of 23% and the corporate rate to 25% and pay for a territorial system. We wanted to prove to people what you could do. And then if you want to add some back, we're fine with that, but if you're going to add it back, you got to raise somebody's taxes. And so we started at zero. We went to what we call the zero option.
So I'll recognize the next hand that I see, but I wanted to encourage some of the students in the audience to have a question pretty soon. So if you're a student, start thinking. Dixon. He is not a student.
Yes, I am. That's why I'm here. I wanted to ask you, you kind of indicated when you shifted over to asking us to vote for our congresspeople that you didn't comment on where you think the president's going to come out on this, and can he still play an influence on it, and what do you think he's likely to do?
Sure. Well, let me answer first the question you didn't ask that you probably wanted to ask. And then I'll answer the specific question, why did the president walk away from this deal? That's the question that everybody always wants to ask. I was not a virgin at this. As John said, I negotiated the balanced budget agreement in 1996 for President Clinton. And to do that, I had to spend months and months and months locked up in conference rooms with Newt Gingrich, and you all owe me a lot for that, I'm telling you. But I knew President Clinton, and I knew him really well. Now, I didn't know everything, but I knew him really well, and therefore, as John and I talked, I could negotiate on his behalf, Dixon, and we could reach an agreement with Republicans. And don't think that wasn't a partisan time. It was pretty partisan. They were impeaching him. That's kind of partisan. When President Obama called Al and me and asked us to co-chair this commission, that's the similar job of trying to negotiate a deal between the two sides. And the first rule as a negotiator is to know your client. Well, neither one of us knew the president very well. And so we violated that rule. The second rule you learn from Professor Parker is if you don't know your client, then you darn well better define success up front. Because the worst thing you can do is go about and negotiate this deal and come bring it back and he walks away from it. So if this was what, we felt after spending lots of time with him and with his economic team, if this was success, the deal we brought back was here. It was that much better. And, and I expected him to be like Bill Clinton would have been. Bill Clinton would have said, I love this deal. This deal is great. Matter of fact, it was all my idea. He's something else. Yeah, he really is something else. But he didn't. And when he walked away from it, I was surprised. I was amazed. I was angry. I just didn't get it. And because, like John said, I thought it would be, I thought it was the right thing to do, period. And sometime later, we had about an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes just for two of us. And as George would tell you, that's a long time to spend just two people, with the president. But basically what he said, and there's some sense here, that the reason he walked away from it was he felt like that if he endorsed it, that he would be savaged by the left because we had real entitlement cuts in the plan, and that if he endorsed it, the Republicans would automatically be against it because he was for it. And Al and others believe there's some truth there too. And so basically his rationale was that the best chance for success was to use it as the framework for the discussions he had with Speaker Boehner over the summer, and he felt that could lead to success. I thought that was, not the right strategy, not the right tactics, and but if it worked, it'd been great. I met with him a number of times since then, and he assured me that if he was reelected, that he would support the framework of what we had, what our commission had recommended. So now let's look at where we are today. There are 3 budgets out there. There's one budget from the House Republicans and one budget from the Senate Democrats. Neither of those 2 budgets, in my opinion, will lead us to the promised land. Both of them put all the political pain in the other party's priorities. And so I don't think either one of them will help us at all to get to that grand bargain that we need to have in order to put our fiscal house in order. The president also has a budget out there. And, I've been pretty tough on the president, as I think you can see. But I think you have to give him a lot of credit for what he's done in this latest budget. He's got 3 items in there that I think give us the kernels of hope that we can actually get a bipartisan grand bargain still. Those kernels of hope are as follows. And all of these are things that make the Democrats not quite so happy, but fall in the bailiwick of what the Republicans said they have to have in order to agree to a deal. The first thing is something that Professor Boskin has recommended, and that is that we go to what's called the change CPI as a measure of inflation, and all it is Michael would tell you, is it's a more accurate gauge of inflation. And the reason that's important is that takes a step toward making Social Security more sustainably solvent. It doesn't, by any stretch of imagination, get us there, but it's hard to get us there unless we do something sensible like that. And he has that in his budget, and that infuriates the Democrats, even though it's a relatively small thing, and the Republicans like it. The second thing he has in there, I think, that gives us some kernel of hope, is he has about $400 billion worth of Medicare cuts. The number doesn't make any difference at all because, you could have, both sides could have $400 billion worth of Medicare cuts, but they'd be talking about 2 different things because the Democrats almost always want to have it on the provider side and the Republicans on the beneficiary side, and so they could have the same amount, but it's really 2 different worlds. The president actually has $53 billion of this in the form of beneficiary cuts. And again, that's a step in the right direction as far as the Republicans are concerned, and gives me the kernel of hope we can have a deal. And the third thing he's got is he has some small amount of recommendations for revenue neutral corporate tax reform. And again, that's the step in the right direction. The problem is, even with the better estimates that have come out from the Congressional Budget Office, they came out with estimates day before yesterday or yesterday, I can't remember. I don't even know what time I'm on. But of the deficit would be about $200 billion less this year. But that's all temporary because it's because people pay taxes early in 2012, and that counts in this fiscal year, and because we got a dividend from Fannie and Freddie, it's a one-time dividend. So again, it really doesn't make any difference. But the president's budget only gets the deficit to around 73% of GDP. The debt, to only 73% of GDP. And it stabilizes it for a while, but in the out years, it immediately begins to escalate up again. And what we have to do is stabilize it and then get it on a downward path and keep it on a downward path. And so what we did, Senator Simpson and myself, is we came out with a revision to our original plan that has about $1 trillion more in cuts than the president has in his plan, and about $300 billion less in revenue. And basically by doing that, we can get the debt below 70% of GDP, keep it on a downward path, and whereas we take about $2.5 trillion out of the deficits over the next 10 years. It takes about 10 to 12 over the second 10 years, and the out years are really where the problems lie. One of the reasons, two of the reasons I like what we recommended is whereas we have more deficit reduction than the president has, we actually get rid of the sequester, which I think is stupid, and replace it with, I think, better reforms and more cuts, but better, more targeted. And by doing that, we actually have about $90 billion of fewer cuts in 2014 and 15, and most of our cuts begin in 2016, about 95% of them. And the reason we did that is we didn't want to disrupt what I believe is still a pretty fragile economic recovery. And I think we got to really guard against doing that. And if you look at the things we cut, we tried to make sure that we didn't do anything that hurt the truly disadvantaged. So you'll see lots of low-income protections on the things that we did.
I suppose it would have the initials problem, but maybe we should have a Bowles-Schultz presidential campaign in 16.
Well, as long as you made it the other way, I might consider it. But I guarantee you, just yeah. But I promise you, Secretary Schultz and I could get in the room, and in an hour, we could come up with a plan that I bet 90% of you in this room would vote for. And it's not just you all. Senator Simpson and I have talked to well over 1 million people in the last 2 years, probably closer to 2 million people. And, we've talked to Tea Party groups, we've talked to labor groups, we've talked to liberals, we've talked to conservatives. And if we get an hour with them, and we'll take any question, at the end of the time, they're for it. I think the American people are way ahead of the politicians. The reason we have a hard time getting something done in Washington is everybody worships the great god of re-election. And, they are really afraid. The Democrats are afraid to do the things we have to do on entitlements, and the Republicans are afraid of, doing what, they might have to do on revenue, even though it's a relatively small amount. But common sense tells you that we got to do these. We got to make the tough choices. I mean, that joke I told about Ernst Rutherford, isn't really a joke. We got to make the tough decisions. We got to make the hard decisions, the politically tough decisions. If we do, the country will be in great shape, and we can compete with anybody. But if we don't, we really are well on our way to becoming a second-rate power. And that's why it's so important for people like you to, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, Republican or Democrat, to really talk to your members of Congress and to get them to do the right stuff.
I'm sure I could get in trouble for this, but what about a question from somebody under the age of 25?
Well, we could go over to Facebook if you want to.
I've got 2 weeks to go, so it's perfect. Thank you. So you were talking about how we bounce from crisis to crisis, and also how the government is becoming increasingly partisan. Do you think we're headed towards a political crisis where we'll be forced to address some of these partisan issues and change the way that the government works?
I honestly don't know. It depends on whether, I wore this tie today because it's got ostriches on it. And, it's whether we wake up. It's really up to us. I made the graduation speech at American University the other day. And, I ended up just throwing out I had all these nice little platitudes in it and everything. And, roses are red, you be good, I will be too, And instead I talked to them like this. And I swear at the end, they stood up and honest to a person, gave me a standing ovation. That's not the important thing. The important thing is they got it. They know you're getting stuck with all these problems that my generation hasn't dealt with. And none of us have clean hands. And they have formed, and it spread really quickly, an organization called the Can Kicks Back. And it's really spread to, I don't know if it's gotten here to Stanford. I forgot to check. but it's gone viral throughout the country. And, to try to make sure that that the members of Congress and the administration understand that what we're doing today simply is not right. And we also formed this group called Fix the Debt, and you can find it at fixthedebt.org. And we've had about 600,000 people over the last month sign this petition, simply asking people to put the ultra-partisanship aside and to pull together rather than pull apart, and let's solve this problem as George Shultz would do if he were Treasury Secretary today.
On that note, I think we'll call it an evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That'd be terrific. Yeah, con institutes and how that's all there.
It was funny, I actually just ran into a friend of mine.
Well, you might. You might actually.